Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens, the historic treasure of Akron and all of Northeast Ohio. The Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens Guild supports and promotes our beloved local historic landmark. Presents Pastor Bob Schneider, Mission Pastor, The Chapel, Akron, Ohio. Speaking about canal boats, oatmeal, and tires. What they never taught you in your Ohio history class. Recorded at the September 19th, 2023 Guild meeting held in the Manor House Reception Hall in Stan Hywet.
Good evening. That worked the first time. I want to thank everybody for showing up this evening. I think we're going to have a good program. We have an interesting speaker with some interesting things about the city of Akron. I want to thank Patrick for taking care of getting our speaker. He's been wonderful as far as that, making all the arrangements for our speakers and trips and so forth. So thanks a lot, Patrick. All right, this evening our speaker is Pastor Bob Schneider, Mission Pastor Emeritus of the Chapel. Your family. Bob has 3 married sons and 10 grandchildren, and for 41 years was married to his wife, Myra, who passed away in 2018. He has a BA in Sociology and Social Work from the University of Akron and a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Bob served on the pastoral staff of the chapel for 37 years from 1980 to 2017. He served as pastor of missions and global outreach and was responsible for recruiting, training, and assigning missionaries throughout the world. Also in that capacity at the chapel, he visited over 60 countries. Bob currently serves at the Akron campus as the pastor of Care and Seniors. He recently completed a book called Blessed to be a Blessing, The History of Chapel Missions. Please welcome Pastor Bob Schneider.
Thank you, Phyllis. I actually retired again 2 weeks ago, so I call it pastoral recycling. I've been recycled. But hey, it is an honor to be here. This is a treasured place in my family. My wife was a social worker at the Haven of Rest for about 25 years, and she used to bring clients here just to give them a different slice of life. And we brought our grandchildren here many times for Christmas and to walk through the wonderful house at Christmas time. It's just a treasure. So I am really thrilled also to be here with volunteers who love history. I am one of them, and I am honored to be in your presence. Anytime I meet people that love history, I'm excited. I also work as a volunteer down at the Mustel Museum. I used to work as a docent in the home, but I'm on 3 different boards right now, and I'm still working, so I don't have time. But I do tours along the Ohio Erie Canal, so if you ever want one, I'm glad to help. I'm going to have to really be on my toes tonight because you guys know history, so I can't fool you. So it's going to be a challenge to do that. Something on this computer just changed. We knew that was going to happen, right? So we will see if we're back to normal. So I want to begin with this. This is a picture of my grandfather taken 108 years ago in 1915. And I have a feeling that this group knows a lot about the year 1915. So it's a picture on the steps of B.F. Goodrich Corporation, and my grandfather moved here in 1912 to work there. And of course, the old-timers never called it B.F. Goodrich. What did they call it? The Goodrich. I worked at the Goodrich. And if you have a magnifying glass, I tried to get Mark Price to help me with this. The football there says 09, and I know it can't be 1909 because he wasn't there then. So I think this is 1915. He played on the Industrial League football. And I read a book at the University of Akron recently on the history of professional football in Akron. We did have that in the 1890s and early 1900s. He probably played against Jim Thorpe and Newt Rockne and those guys that came through here. So as I did more research on this, I found out my other grandfather moved here in 1912, and he came here to work for a company, I think it's called Goodyear. And so he worked for Goodyear, and I started doing a little bit more research, and I thought, well, why here? Of course, we know why everybody was moving here is because of the rubber companies, but why here? And it kind of led me on a search of why people came to this area and what was that all about. So I've entitled my presentation this evening, Canal Boats, Oatmeals, and Tires, What They Never Taught You in Your Ohio History Class. And that's really what this is about. So we're going to start with a little quiz, not exactly a quiz, but at least a picture we need to identify as to why people were coming here. Does anyone know what that's a picture of? Does that anything recognized there? That was the first community settled in Summit County. I think you know the name. And that is Western Reserve Academy. So it's Hudson. And we all know Western Reserve Academy. We know Case Western Reserve University. We know Western Reserve Hospital. But what is all this Western Reserve stuff? And one of the things I learned very quickly going through my history, I'm working on a new computer, so maybe a few glitches, is this area was called the Connecticut Reserve. After the Revolution, the Continental Army, Continental Congress I should say, asked all of the states to give up their western land claims. Many of these states like Connecticut and Pennsylvania and others, they took their latitude boundaries of their state and said, oh, we'll take everything to the Mississippi River. Or we might take everything to the Pacific Ocean. They said, no, you can't do that. You've got to give up that land. So Connecticut gave up their long land claims, but they held 3.5 million acres in reserve, which is called, again, the Connecticut Reserve, the Western Reserve, with 3.5 million acres. It basically started just below Erie, Pennsylvania, down to the 41st parallel. The 41st parallel is roughly Waterloo Road and 224. That's actually the Continental Divide as well. If you're over where Young's Restaurant used to be, and a rain comes down, if it lands 100 yards one way, it goes into the Tuscarawas River, which goes in the Muskegon River, which goes in the Ohio River, which goes in the Mississippi River, and that drop of rain ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. If that same raindrop lands 100 yards north of that, it goes into the Cuyahoga River, into Lake Erie, out the St. Lawrence Seaway, into the North Atlantic. So that is the Continental Divide, if you will. So this is the Connecticut Western Reserve. They gave up that area, and many of you, because we're right in the neighborhood, know Treaty Line Road. Many of you may not know why it's called Treaty Line Road. Because it was the treaty line of the western boundary of the United States. It ran right down what we would call today the towpath along the Cuyahoga and Tuscarawas River all the way down to Bolivar. If you are bicycle fans or hikers like I am, I've been to Fort Lawrence many times. You can see that on the edge of your map. That's how the dividing line went for the western boundary of the United States. The rest was Indian territory. Then it ran diagonally down to roughly in the Dayton area. And because of the Treaty of Fort McIntosh, where the Indians were defeated in that battle, that area became open for settlement. So General Anthony Wayne defeated the Indians, and then later the Treaty of Greenville opened it even more. That was in 1795. Well, the state of Connecticut at that time wanted to have public education. They were very, very excited about public education. And to raise money, they sold 3 million acres to something called the Connecticut Land Company. Now, 500,000 acres they kept in reserve, and you can go there today. It's from Huron to Sandusky. And if you're an old timer, I was told this 30 years ago, they said you can find old timers that call that the Firelands. And they call that the Firelands. Anyone know why it's called the Firelands? Why?
Because they had to bring fire. Some state had to bring fire and people were allowed to come and settle that.
Yeah. Close. Yeah. What it is the British had burned down homes of the Connecticut settlers during the Revolutionary War. And for those people that lost their homes to the British fires, they reserved that area around Huron and Sandusky, and they called it the Firelands. So the state of Connecticut sold those 3 million acres to the Connecticut Land Company for $1.2 million. And one of the leaders of the Connecticut Land Company was a surveyor by the name of Moses Cleveland. And no, that's not spelled wrong. That's how the name is and should have been. But apparently in the early 1800s, when a newspaper, probably the Cleveland Press or Plain Dealer or the Forerunner, they were setting type the old way, and they did not have room for all the letters, so the typesetter just got rid of A. So to this day, it is and will be Cleveland. So in June of 1796, and then again in 1797, they came and surveyed this entire area with poles and chains. Can you imagine surveying the entire Western Reserve? They established townships that were 5 miles square. There was to be a school and a church in each square. And one of the first men to settle in this area was David Hudson. You'll never guess what community he founded. He came in 1799 ahead of his family, and it was very, very rural, forest, very, very difficult to find where to put the stakes. I am told that if you go to the intersection of 91 and 303 and have the right permissions, there is a cover or a manhole cover or something that you can actually find the stake that David Hudson established to establish his settlement, which became Hudson. Now, not too long after that, another guy came to the area, and his name was David Bacon. David Bacon was a pastor. He's a very strong Christian pastor, and he actually founded his community as a Christian community in 1807. And it was a very primitive community. Only a few families came in. He was trying to get other people. All these people are from Connecticut, and he was recruiting people to come in. Today, you would know that as Talmadge, and there's the famous Talmadge Circle with 8 different roads. I think it's the busiest circle in Summit County, if not a few counties around. David founded that as a Christian community with a church and a school in the middle and a meeting house. One of the interesting things about Talmadge is it was established as a community following biblical principles, but they banned alcohol. And what I didn't realize is I lived close to Talmadge, and when I moved in 1989, that law was still in place. So the prohibition of alcohol in Talmadge started in 1807, was there until the 1990s. David finally gave up and moved back to Connecticut because he couldn't get enough people to move there and stay, but stay they did. And soon after Bacon left, another guy came from Connecticut. They're all from Connecticut, and that was Captain Jonathan Hart. Captain Jonathan Hart, do I have his picture? I do not, do I? Well, he established Middlebury. Now, Middlebury is really hard to describe, but those of you that know Goodyear, Middlebury basically extends from where Case and East Market come together, just down from the Goodyear Clock Tower where the Little Cuyahoga River comes through, running along Market Street over to where Bookdale attaches itself to Market, and then down to the Little Cuyahoga River where Carter Jones is. And that was Middlebury, and it was the first community in this area. There were shops, there were factories, there were furnaces, there was a hotel, and the very first cemetery in this area, called the Old Cemetery on Newton Street. Many people think Glendale's oldest cemetery. It is not. This cemetery, Middlebury Seminary, was founded in 1808. And I've been in it. A friend of mine was the city law director, or he was something. He gave me the key, the secret key to get in there one time, because it's been locked since the Civil War. But there are grave sites there of Revolutionary War heroes. So it is the oldest cemetery in the area. And the first settlers that came here came to Middlebury, but very soon after that, in 1811, the first settler to what we would call Akron came. His name was Minor Spicer. He came with his brother Amos and a friend by the name of Paul Williams, and they settled in what's now called Akron. Now, Paul Williams' plot of land, a few hundred acres, is where you'd find St. Bernard's and E.J. Thomas. That's where his plot. You'll never guess where Spicer's was. On Spicer today, yeah, right just northeast of the corner of Spicer and Exchange Street is where he established his homestead. There were still Indians in the territory, and if you've ever seen Samuel Lane's History of Summit County, he has a wonderful story about an Indian that came visiting Spicer and his wife. Of course, that's Spicer's school. That's the current school. My mother went there in the 1920s, and it was a much different wooden building back then. But this was the beginning of Akron. Now, the first county in Ohio was Trumbull County. Every name that you hear has a name and often connect with Connecticut. Trumbull is named after Governor Trumbull of Connecticut. The county seat, the first county seat is Warren. We all know Warren, Ohio. That was named after Moses Warren, who was one of the surveyors. In 1800, they had an auction, and they were selling off portions of land. And in that land sale, Simon Perkins comes onto the scene. He was one of the surveyors for the Connecticut Land Company. It was actually the Erie Land Company then. And he moved to Warren, Ohio. He became a general during the War of 1812. And at this time, when they had the land sale, he bought large tracts of lands in this area. Now, Simon, many people don't realize this. You, I'm sure, do. Never lived in Akron. He came to Akron, helped establish Akron, but it was his son that became famous. But his son was the co-founder of Glendale Cemetery, and he built a pretty cool house. So, one of the little tidbits of history that I think this very historical, astute group will know is he had a very famous man that cared for his sheep, who was who? John Brown, that's right. So John Brown was a sheep herder before he did some other things he became famous for. So now we're up to 1820, and Ohio is an agricultural state, and how in the world, after you fed your family, do you make any money by selling your goods? Where's all the population at that time? Well, it's in Boston, it's in New York, it's in Philadelphia, it's in Baltimore, and how do you get all that grain in wagons over the Allegheny Mountains? That is a tough road to hoe. And fortunately, New York had an idea. They had the New York Erie Canal. So Simon Perkins got a hold of Paul Geddes, who was the chief engineer, and he mapped out a possible route for what was going to be called the Ohio Erie Canal. There are actually two canals. The Miami Canal is over there on the western part of the state. The one that we know as the Erie Canal is on the right-hand state. There were a number of people bidding for that, but Simon Perkins was really crafty. And he got the right people at the right time and says, I will donate you the land that I have if the canal comes through here. And he worked and he worked and he worked. In fact, Governor DeWitt Clinton from New York came and lobbied. And when they had the groundbreaking on July 4th, 1825, Governor DeWitt Clinton was there helping turn the shovel. That's over by Newark. Have you ever been there? My wife and I drove there about 10 years ago. Where's that plaque? I'm looking at that famous brown Ohio plaque. We found it, and that's where they broke ground on July 4th of 1825. The goal was to complete it, at least the first section, by July 4th, 1827, which seems absolutely amazing. But Perkins moved fast, and as many of you know, by December of 1825, he had already gone and established the plat for the city of Akron. Of course, there was no Summit County then. That came in 1840, so he went to the county seat, which was what back then? Ravenna. So we were part of Portage County, and he went to Ravenna and established that. So here we go. The Ohio Erie Canal, first section done from Akron to Cleveland. Their goal was to finish it in 2 years. Tens of thousands of workers, mostly Irish. In fact, if you know where the old Furnace Street Mission is and where Luigi is, that area was called Little Dublin because there were so many Irishmen living there in just squalid conditions. And yet, can you believe they built that entire section in 2 years? When I have kids come with their parents down to the Museum Museum and I tell them that story, I said, those of you that are around Akron about 10 or 15 years ago, if you remember, they were working on the west leg of the freeway and all they had to do was 2 miles. And it took them, with all the modern equipment in the world, it took them almost 3 years to do 2 miles. And these guys with pick and shovels did Akron to Cleveland in 2. What does that tell you about our work ethic? I don't know. But on July 3rd of 1827, the canal boat called the State of Ohio was dropped in the canal at Lock 2, where we have the baseball park now. And there were bands and all kinds of speeches and large crowds. And they took off, and 24 hours later, they arrived in Cleveland on July 4th, 1827, to more fireworks and bands and all those wonderful things. So from Akron to Cleveland, there's about 44 locks, and that goes from Akron up to Cleveland. I say up to Cleveland, it's really down to Cleveland. When we have school children, I said, you know when your mom and dad say you're going up to Cleveland, you're going down to Cleveland. Cleveland's 400 feet lower. So if you look at the way the gates of the locks work, as you're going north, you're going downhill, and you're going towards Summit Lake, you're going uphill, actually beyond Summit Lake. In the whole state, there's 146 locks. That's going all the way down the Ohio River, and a number of actual, they call them aqueducts. If you've been down to Bolivar, there's an old aqueduct there. You can ride your bicycle over. And the canal was 40 feet wide at the top, 24 feet wide at the bottom, but they always had to keep 4 feet of water in there because it had to be about 30 feet wide because the canal boats had to pass each other. If you had one-way canal boats, you'd be in big trouble because somebody's going to meet in Massillon or somewhere and they can't get by. So they had to have 4 feet of water. And they created reservoirs like Summit Lake and like West Branch Reservoir all over the state to be able to feed water into the canals because the canals leaked and the locks leaked. And the towpath gets its name, obviously, you can see in the picture, the horses or mules actually towed with a cord those canal boats, and they would often have a second set of mules on board that they could relieve. And one of our presidents, the young men that led the horses were called mule skinners. And one of our presidents did that as his first ever job. Does anyone know which president? Garfield, that's right. Garfield was like 16 years old. And I think he fell in and got sick or got malaria or something, so his mom wouldn't let him do it anymore. But James Garfield was one of those. The canal boats were generally about 80 feet long and about 14 feet wide. Some carried passengers, some carried freight, a lot of agricultural products. If you don't think the canal was critical to Akron becoming Akron, think of this. The year before they finished the canal, Akron sent 1,000 bushels of grain to the East Coast. The year after the canal was finished, they sent 250,000 bushels. So that's a huge impact, and it only grew. So all that impact was just very, very clear from the beginning. Now the locks were 90 feet by 15. I think they modeled after the New York Erie Canal. So you make the locks 90 by 15, you make the boats 80 by 14, that saves water. So you don't have to use as much water to lift and lower the boats. I asked the school children how much water does it take to fill the lock up, and they say 1,000 gallons or 50 gallons or 5. It's actually 100,000 gallons it takes. And each lock would raise the boats 10 feet or lower the boats 10 feet. And the locks were massive. Let me see if I can get my next one here. Oops. Don't do that. There. Those had been cemented over. I think that's up on Canal Road, just south of Rockside Road. But the actual limestone blocks, they weighed anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 pounds. They were huge. And the locks would have gates would keep the water in. There'd be a sluice gate at the bottom. They could let water in and out, and it would raise 10 feet. Now, one thing I never realized, when I was in high school, they built Cascade Plaza. I never had any idea why it was called Cascade Plaza. It's because the Cascade locks are there. If you're at the corner of North Street and Howard Street, where the Muster Museum is, and you go to the Akron baseball stadium, I still say Arrows, it's the Rubber Ducks, it's 150 feet higher. So if each lock raises the boat 10 feet and you have to get 150 feet, how many locks do you need? Exactly. So if you're at the Muster Museum, that's lock 15. So you have 15, 14, 13, 11, 10. When you get to 10, you're in trouble because Martin Luther King Boulevard and West Market Street, and it goes into a tunnel. And if you go to the Federal Building today, they'll never let you go down there. Locks 9, 8, 7, 6, and 5 are underneath Cascade Plaza, which is why they're called the Cascade Locks, why it's called the Cascade Plaza. I was really grateful several years ago when they opened up around the Civic, and now you can go to Lock 4. And they have little jazz concerts down there. I was so thrilled. I remember going from O'Neill's parking deck, Civic Theater, and said, "What is that water?" I had no idea. I was a kid. That was the canal. So that was the Cascade locks that are now hidden underneath. So Akron was founded on water. Water brought things here, but not just because of the canal. Not just because of the canal. There was a genius on the scene who also came from where? Connecticut. Dr. Eliakim Crosby. We've also to Crosby Street and Crosby School. So Crosby comes to town. He lives in Middlebury, and he looks at that Cascade Lock, and he thinks 150 feet drop with all those locks. What would happen if I could turn that into a waterfalls? What would happen if I could make a mill race that could power factories and things? So he got Simon Perkins Jr. and a few other guys together to finance it, and he built his own canal, if you will, his own Crosby's Mill Race. He dammed up the Little Cuyahoga River on Case Avenue, dug a canal above North Street all the way to downtown, ran it right down the middle of Main Street. Have you ever wondered why Main Street is so wide? There was a canal in the middle of it. So the canal, the mill race, ran right through the middle, and then it turned right and went down to the Ohio Erie Canal. So what did they call that? Mill Street, because that was where the first mill was built. So he builds this wonderful mill race, and when you get to the Mill Street and go down, it's a huge drop. And that became a center of commerce. And all of a sudden, it was a second birth of Akron. Grains, mills, distilleries, furnaces. You're to Furnace Street. All that began building. Crosby's Mill Race was the key to that. He built the first one. It was called the old Stone Mill right at the canal and Mill Street. Alexander Cummins, who was a famous, significant figure in Akron, bought the mill. Later in life, his son built a home at 142 Fir Hill. And the family had it until the 1930s, and then it was donated and became the Akron Art Institute. The Akron Art Institute was there, and it burned down in January of 42, burnt to the ground, and it sat empty until about 1949 or 1950, when Reverend Carl Burnham bought it for the chapel. And that's the land that we're sitting on now. So it's just an interesting little connection for me personally. So the Etna Mill is one of the many mills that developed. Again, I said there were iron furnaces, there was factories, mills, all kinds of businesses began to sprout out. And one of them was the Musto store. So we have Joseph and Sarah Musto come to Akron from England, and they opened up a little store near Market and Howard, and they eventually saw the value of reaching out these canal boats coming through. They were pretty smart, and they realized when those canal boats got to the bottom of the hill, it was going to be a long wait coming up. So we think they built the Musto store in their home down there in the 1840s. The reason I say that is we have some bills of sale from like 1850, 1851. And then later on, Fred, their son, and Emma managed the store for many, many years. They lived in a large home right next to the store. And then their son, Ed, took over the store until about the 1880s. This is what it looked like around the time of the Civil War. It's a very blurry picture. I have a better one. Those boats faced about a 3-hour slowdown waiting to go up the hill. So where do they go? They go in the Musto store, the old-fashioned general store from Little House on the Prairie. They could buy just about anything: food, clothing, nails, dry goods, lots of whiskey. It was just a place that they could buy everything they needed while they waited to go up the hill. The painting represents just after the Civil War, I think. In fact, Fred said in the height of the canal days, there would be as many 75 boats a day would pass by the store. Now, eventually, it passed from the Musto family in the early 20th century, went through a series of owners. It was nearly torn down in the 1970s. It was totally dilapidated. And thankfully, because of Virginia Wojo and a whole bunch of restoration people that formed the Cascade Lock Parks Association, it was restored. You can't quite see it, but it's the midst of restoration there. When it was finished, from the 1980s until 2000, we worked on it. It was a joint venture of the Restoration Society, the City of Akron, Metro Parks that were restoring. It was open on July 2nd, the year 2000. John Seiberling was there. Tom Sawyer was there. I think we had an Abraham Lincoln reenactor there. We had everybody there. And so that is what it looks like today. And if you ever come down, let me know. I'll give you a tour. It's a wonderful snapshot into the history of how Akron became Akron. Now, at the same time, right about this time, a German immigrant shows up in Akron around 1849, 50, 51. His name is Ferdinand Schumacher. And he had a little store at the corner, pretty close to Howard and Market Street. And he loved oatmeal, so he started selling oatmeal out of his little store and became very, very popular. So he bought a mill. There used to be a linen mill down at North Street. The building's still there. It's now the Lock 15 restaurant, and there's a wonderful venue down there. But he built what is now called the Old German Mill. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, a friend of his knew the guy that was the quartermaster general for the Union Army. And they were looking for something to feed the troops for breakfast, and he heard about this oatmeal. He says, I need some of that oatmeal. So apparently, as the story goes, he sent 100 barrels of oatmeal to the Union Army, and the rest is history. They went nuts over it. They said, we'll buy all the oatmeal you can make. And he became Akron's richest man. He may have been Akron's first millionaire, I don't know, but he became famous. And it wasn't called Quaker Oats back then, but right across the street there was a large mill, and it was owned by Leicester King. Judge King isn't King School right down the hill, right? So the famous King family. So Judge King had the Cascade Mill, and that's who Schumacher bought it from. He greatly expanded it. So you'll see in the next picture, it says Schumacher's Cascade Mill. And it was a massive mill, made a huge impact on the commerce of the area because of canal boats coming from the south. And then farmers would come from Medina and Portage County bringing their goods there to have the meal ground. Here's another way. This is a historic picture. Now that looks funny. You think, how's that the canal? Well, there was a great turning basin there because boats would come up, they'd drop off the grain, then they'd turn around and come back. And the mill would be ground right on site and then taken up to Lake Erie, and then on the New York Erie Canal, go over to the Hudson River and then on to the cities of the east. This site is now called the Cascade Park, and we've established that to just remind people it's there. Now that is a replica of the water wheel that turned the grain. That wheel, if you were standing next to it, is 18 feet above ground. It also was 18 feet below ground, and it was 10 feet wide. So think of a Ferris wheel. It was a big wheel. And it had 96 buckets to carry water. So water from Crosby's mill race would go up in a pipe and fill the buckets, and the buckets would turn the wheel, and the wheel would turn the grindstones. And if you go down to the Muster Museum, you see a couple of the grindstones that we have found that are still there that would grind the grain that would do that. So that's a wonderful thing to take school children to and talk to them about the history. Some of our engineering guys talk about the engineering that's behind that. Unfortunately, the place burned down in 1904. And it had a devastating impact on him and his empire. Burned down in 1904. This is the remains of the wheel that could still be seen in late 1904. But earlier than that, there was a much greater loss that you may have read about, and that was the Great Fire of 1886. His great jumbo mills on Mill Street burned to the ground. One of the sad things is fire departments do not have universal size fire hoses. So those fire hoses that the rubber companies were making, and actually back then, 1886, it only would have been Goodrich, the hoses didn't have fittings that all fit together. So the place burned to the ground and destroyed everything. But here's the interesting thing. He was part of the temperance movement. In fact, he ran for governor later on the Prohibitionist Party. So the place burns to the ground, and there's mounds and mounds of barley and rye and all this stuff. And the distiller guys come and said, Mr. Schumacher, we'll buy all the grain. He says, I'd sooner it rot than let you ruin the youth of our country. So there. So he did not sell them any grain for alcohol. So he was forced into a merger which became the American Cereal Company. One of the leaders of that was a guy named Henry Kroll. Henry Kroll was a very strong Christian. He ran a mill that he called the Quaker Mill up in Portage County, I think Ravenna area. They merged. They moved to Chicago. There was a tussle for who was going to control. They eventually forced Schumacher out. He was kind of an ornery German and hard to get along with. So they renamed the company the Quaker Oats. Kroll became a great friend of D.L. Moody, and if a student is at the Moody Bible Institute, he may have a scholarship from the Kroll Trust. So that became the American Cereal Company. Now, of course, later, we all know Quaker Square from growing up in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. This was what was in our era, but things never stay the same, do they? So 1975, I wonder what all those guys were grounding holes in those pillars. Why were they grounding holes in the silos? Little did I know it was going to become a hotel. So it became the Quaker Hilton. My uncle stayed there once, and he said he found oatmeal in his slippers, but I think he was pulling my leg. So now in 1870, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. A new era is going to begin, and it was because of the water power we've talked about. There was a surgeon during the Civil War, and he was working in New York trying to make it, and the competition was stiff, and he was not doing well. But he heard, and he needed water power, and he heard there was water power. So he went back. He went to the Cleveland Medical College that you would know as Case Western Reserve. And he went there, and the story has two versions. One, he heard verbally about water power in Akron, or that there was a handbill that he saw from the Chamber of Commerce in Akron that there was water power in Akron. So he came down to Akron. The doctor's name was Dr. Benjamin Franklin Goodrich. He'd been a Civil War surgeon, and he came here and he met with the city leaders and made a presentation and got the financing to start his company in 1870. He was quite an inventor. He liked cutting edge stuff. Apparently he had the first telephone in Akron. They said there was a telephone line running from the first B.F. Goodrich factory to his home on the other side of the canal. And initially they made fire hoses and other products for bicycles and wagons at that time. I think they were the first rubber company in this area. There's some smaller ones that came along, but of course that's when the explosion began. When I was doing the research about my grandfathers, I got some census data from Maine Library, and you probably know all this, but it still boggled my mind. Population of Akron in 1900 was roughly 400,000. In 1920, it was 204,000. Now think about that. 40,000 over 200,000 is probably the fastest growing city in America. But just huge, huge impact in the community. And of course, and you can do the whole rest of the lecture for me, Francis Cyberlini's brother Charles come here. And I'm sure you guys are going to correct me in a few facts, but I have heard that when the first factory opened in 1898 that Irene was there. I don't know whether she pulled the switch, but that she was 8 years old because she was born in 1890. And the amazing thing to me is on their 100th anniversary, she was still with us. You know, when you live to be almost 109, you get to see a lot of history. So just an amazing, amazing story. And as you all know the story better than I about him building parks and homes for his workers and Goodyear Heights and all that happened, and just the impact of being the largest employer in this area and the huge impact that Goodyear Tire and Rubber had during World War II and the contribution they made. My dad worked in the air dock. You think of all the things that happened there. So grateful. I can't even show this slide. This is just so embarrassing. Yes, he built a house. See, when I talk to other groups, this is kind of a big deal. So I won't talk about the house. But so thankful that of all the rubber companies in the world, Goodyear still has its world headquarters in. We are so very thankful. But not to be forgotten, even in this room, there was a competitor, a young farm boy named Harvey Firestone. He'd been making tires for buggies in the 1890s, and he saw the future coming with cars coming along, particularly in Cleveland, which is really big in early car manufacturers. So he starts Firestone Tire and Rubber in 1900 and became the second largest tire company in the world. And again, you know, he always copied us, right? So he built parks and neighborhoods and did a number of things for the city. And even though Bridgestone is now the parent company, we're grateful that there's still been some expansion and racing tires and other things developed, so we're grateful for that. Now again, I talk about change and how things change. One of the bittersweet things for me, because I love trains, but trains began to spell the end of the era. Canal boats had trouble competing in the winter because the canal would freeze. And train tracks don't freeze. and it could run year-round, and they could carry a lot more freight. And the decline began. If you're on North Street coming down from Market Street, you'll pass a couple railroad trestles. Even looking up the canal, you'll see those trestles that were built in the 1800s, and that began to change transportation in America because they could handle more freight, they weren't affected. But the big disaster that really impacted the canal permanently was the Great Flood of 1913. I could kick myself for not asking my grandfather stories about this because he was living here then. This was the greatest flood probably in the history of the Midwest. It actually hit several states. It happened on March 23rd, 1913. There have been heavy snows all winter long, and according to there's actually a book about this, there was still ice on the ground. The ground was still frozen. And on frozen ground, we had not 1 inch of rain, not 2 inches of rain. We had 9.5 inches of rain on frozen ground. A dam broke in the Portage Lakes, and billions of gallons of water rushing toward downtown Akron. They telegraphed Columbus very, very quickly, said, can we blow the dam? Can we blow the locks? Can we dynamite the locks? And they said yes. So, and I can't tell you which locks, but they dynamited the locks so that the water would not destroy downtown Akron. And that rush of water, I think, went all the way as far north as Peninsula. Over 500 people, this talks about 500 homeless locally, but over 500 people lost their lives in this flood. This picture always boggles my mind. Those are houses floating on Case Avenue. So Case Avenue, because the Little Cuyahoga became the Mississippi River. And it just had a huge, huge impact, and it destroyed basically the canal. This is just one of many, many pictures that it just wiped out the canal. The amazing thing, if you go down to the Muster Museum, you can see a picture where the water came right up to the porch and stopped. Just missed taking out the Muster Museum. So it sealed the fate of the Ohio Erie Canal as the canal, but again, progress comes, rebirth comes, good things happen with people who are creative. So today we've rediscovered the Ohio Erie Canal, and thanks to the work of John Seiberling, thankful for him, and Ralph Regula, the whole Cuyahoga Valley National Park was established in '75 when Gerald Ford was president. The towpath was established, and it's amazing the impact it's had on smaller communities, from Peninsula and Boston down to Clinton, Canal Fulton, and all the way down. If you're a hiker or biker, you can go now from Cleveland down to Dover. And it's just made a huge economic and social impact on our communities, on our people, on our families. Anytime I'm out there, you just see all kinds of people walking their dogs, women pushing strollers, people biking. This whole redeveloped towpath has been such a blessing to the area and to our community. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and I would be glad to take any questions. Thank you. Thank you. Yes?
Living back in your brain, you showed that earliest cemetery.
Yeah.
Middlebury.
Yeah.
And there was a street there and a couple of houses. Do you know what street that is?
That's Newton Street.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on Newton Street, just almost at the bottom. Well, not quite the bottom of the hill, but it's on Newton Street. I guess that's technically part of Goodyear Heights.
It is part of it.
Yeah, but there's a padlock on the gate, and I think they do mow the grass in there. I think I actually never gave the key back. I think I actually still have the key to that. But you would have trouble reading the headstones. You'd almost need to take that carbon paper and do rubbings and stuff. But it's actually Newton Street. Yeah. And later on, ask me about Glendale Cemetery, and I'll tell you an interesting story about that. I don't want to take So Mr. Cummins was a pharmacist. But a pharmacist back then was a chemist. And his son died, and the only cemetery then, in 1837, in Akron, was by Buchtel Hall, and it was bad soil, clay, water, and if you dug a grave, it filled with water really quickly. And he couldn't bear his son being in a grave, so he put him in a casket with formaldehyde and preserved him for a year. And he says, we've got to come up with something. So he traveled to Boston and Rochester, New York, looking at examples of good cemeteries. And he came back in 37, 38 with an idea to build a Akron Rural Cemetery. presented that idea, Simon Perkins and Juniors and others, and that's how Glendale got started. Then his son, Alexander Cummins' son, started the business there, and he's the one that built the home on Fir Hill that became the Art Institute, that became where the chapel is. So that's our long connection. Yeah. Other questions? I may not have the answer, but I'll listen. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm just glad the computer worked. That was touch and go for a while. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. The hostel store, does it operate all year round, or is it like summer?
In the summer, it's open every day. Later in the year, it's open like Saturdays and Sundays. And I've been delinquent.
Walked over and it wasn't.
Yeah, I've been delinquent as a docent the last several months because I'm involved in too many things right now. So usually they call me when they have a tour group come through, and I'll do that. But I should know that question.
Well, that's all right.
Yeah.
You answered it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, call first. That's right. Thank you. All right.
Is there any other business anybody would like to bring up at this time? Pastor Schneider, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate being here, and thank you, Patrick, for suggesting this. Well done. Oh, and of course, Jim.
Well, I'll tell you how this all came about. I was nosy Rosie that I am. I'm just talking to one of our guests in the house who happened to be up. And we started a conversation. He told me about his presentation. And I said, give me your name and address. I'll give it to Pat.
Okay, there we go. And you know, Kevin Bacon then, right? 7 degrees till Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, but that's the town.
I guess with that, we're done for the night. Thanks so much for coming out. This is...
Many thanks to Pastor Bob Schneider for sharing his interesting new look at the history of the city of Akron with the Stan Hywet Gilde members. The Stan Hywet Gilde and Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens partners in volunteer service to benefit beautiful and historic Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens.